Should we start? Well, I will just have a brief introduction. Welcome everyone to this third of our meetings. And it's a very great pleasure to have as our reader and introducing a text, Professor Tamara Grdzelidze from the State University in Tbilisi. I have known Tamara for a very long time, since she was a research student in Oxford, where she did a DPhil, a doctorate on St. Maximus the Confessor. And for many years, she worked as executive secretary for the Faith and Order section of the World Council of Churches, and edited a number of books, collections of papers at that time. And then after that, she was appointed ambassadress for Georgia to the Vatican cities, a wonderful appointment. And then when that term came to an end, she went back to teaching at the State University in Tbilisi. And she's going to talk to us about a little known aspect of Mount Athos. Mount Athos is, of course, very famous to everyone, familiar to everyone here, but probably the presence of Georgian monks in the Middle Ages is less familiar. And it's about them, or one of them, that Tamara is going to talk and introduce a reading. And the reading is taken from a volume that she herself translated, a volume, Georgian Monks on Mount Athos, a very useful volume. So over to you, Tamara.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. Good evening, it's rather afternoon in England, right? So it's quite late in the evening here in Tbilisi. I greet you all, and I'm very happy to be able to share with you tonight some of the insights of one of my favorite texts, that is the life of St. George the Athenite. So I don't know if I should take it for granted that all of you know what is Mount Athos about. Probably it's good to place it geographically. So it's in northern Greece, Macedonian region of northern Greece. It's one of the three legs of the Chalkidiki Peninsula, and it's known for various monasteries, Orthodox monasteries that exist there until today. And it's a very important center of spiritual life in the Orthodox world. Mount Athos attracted solitary monks already from the 9th century. There are documents that they resided there. It was a quiet and comfortable place probably to be to live in solitude and pray. And from the mid-10th century, there started monastic revival by Athanasius, who founded the Lavra and who gave shelter to the Georgian monks who arrived to the Holy Mountain very soon after his arrival, after the foundation of the Lavra. And by the end of the 10th century, they started creating a monastery of their own, which is known as Iviron, because the Greeks called it Moniton Ibiron, so Iviron. So this is a very basic sort of description of what happened behind these lines. First was the arrival of a small group of Georgians. Later in 1970, a famous ex-general from Georgia joined the community, who provided to start a monastery of their own. Also, on the other hand, there were these negotiations with the imperial court, since the emperor himself became the patron of the monastic settlement from the beginning, from the time when Nicephorus Phocas became emperor in 963-64. So I'm arguing elsewhere when I write or speak about Iviron that the monastery of the Iberians was set a model for establishing linguistically and culturally distinct settlements on the Holy Mountain. Worth noting that this happened before the schism of 1054. And the significance of this monastery goes both ways. So it contributed to its presence. So it was the first non-Greek monastery, as I said. So it contributed to the establishment of this monastic settlement. And on the other hand, it was a very important venue, important place for Georgia, and influenced hugely spiritual, cultural, and political aspects of the Georgian state. For the sake of placing Father George Athenite, of whom we will be speaking, in the right context, I'm offering you a rather long text, but I hope you will enjoy going through these lines. It was written in the 11th century by George the Minor, as he calls himself, and the text was commissioned by a famous George the Recluse, monk from the Mount of Mirabilis in Black Mountain in Antioch. So we, you have the text in front of you, I hope, and you notice that some of the parts are in italics, so these are like small comments, and then the major text goes with larger fonts. So from the Holy Mountain, George the Minor addresses George the Great Recluse in the beginning of this text on Mount Mirabilis in the monastery of St. Simeon, because George the Minor was asked by George the Recluse to describe the life and death of Father George the Hagiorite. Since there was a second holy letter from you addressed to my unworthy self, who spent much time with Father George and was enlightened by him and loved him with a love similar to divine. And even more, at the time of his departure from this world and his ascension to God, according to the desire and will of Father George, I was beside him together with the Archbishop of Chkondidi, John, brother of Peter Patricius, who was sent as ambassador to the imperial city by King Bagrat the Sevastos. For this reason, I, the unworthy, like a son who loves his father, or even more, loves Christ, have been compelled to describe in detail and fully the death and departure from this world of our Holy Father, George the Hagiorite. So then goes a short summary in my words. So it's like we need it in order to understand how important was Father George, how learned he was, and how highly esteemed he was in both places, in Constantinople and in Georgia. So on the invitation of King Bagrat, the Georgian king, Father George traveled to his homeland in 1059-1060, assisting with ecclesial and intellectual activities, as well as spiritual guidance given to many, including the king himself. In 1062, the Turkish Seljuks, led by Sultan Alparslan, invaded the Georgian lands, the area where Father George was originally. According to the author, the local population fell in great distress, struggling between life and death. Under those circumstances, Father George was very concerned about the young ones and decided to offer help. So he collected a group of young orphans for taking them to the Holy Mountain so that they would be raised in Iviron and would live in the monastery of the Iberians. That served two purposes: caring for the orphans, but also providing potential Georgian monks for Iviron, where rivalry between the Greeks and Georgians had been unsettling. The author of the Vita calls that deed high and astounding in many ways. At that time, so that during his stay in Georgia, Father George realized that the day of his departure was drawing near. So he asked King Bagrat to let him leave for the Holy Mountain, where the light of knowledge of the divinely spiritual books had first shone through our Holy Father Euthymius, and then through this blessed Father George, so that he should also die there and join the heavenly light, and to dedicate this number of children like the rational sheep to our Holy Father Euthymius by settling them in his spot. Here is a beautiful recollection by the author of the words spoken by Father George in front of King Bagrat. So it goes like this. O King, as I obeyed your order and left a land of my exile and wandering, where I was far from many worldly troubles, let you now obey my humility. Now, like so many times before, let me go to the country of my exile. Send me with prayer and blessing, so that I may reach the graves of my spiritual fathers, like the patriarch Jacob, who died in Egypt but was taken to promised land to be buried next to Abraham and Isaac. And like the bones of Joseph were taken from Egypt and placed with his ancestors. If by my stay here, your service to God and the order of your kingdom has gained in any way, it is because of your grace, because you have invited me rather than because I came myself. And now take your letter and look at it where you promised to provide for me. King in your land, direct me now to the king of another land and to the city of Constantinople, the gathering place of all, so that from there I may be sent to the heavenly king, to the city, a gathering place of the worthy and a resting place of those who expend efforts. Great is the Lord, exceedingly praised in the city of the Lord of powers, as it is said by David, where the mighty of the Lord are exalted from this world. King Bagrat supplied Father George with gifts and treasure, and with a royal letter addressed to the Emperor Constantine Ducas, who was then the emperor. Since Iviron had been under the imperial patronage from the day of its inception, Father George needed a special permission from the emperor to bring to the monastery of the Iberians up to 80 orphans. On the arrival to Constantinople, Father George, accompanied by the Georgian nobility, was invited to the palace. And then the text goes. When the monk appeared in front of the emperor, he venerated and praised him according to custom, offering his prayer and blessing for him and his son. There the emperor experienced the divine spiritual appearance of Father George and the humble and contrite words coming out of his mouth that easily penetrated the mind of the listeners, while the calmness of his eyes reflected the stillness of the inner powers of his soul, while his humble and sharp words bore witness to the intelligence of his soul, on account of which the emperor said to Peter Patricius, one of the nobles from Georgia, I am grateful to the Lord Bagrat Sevastos that he directed to our kingdom such men, resembling the angels. Although he is Georgian by origin, he is adorned with our custom in everything. Then he read the letters as addressed to him by King Bagrat Sevastos, in which it was said, Rejoice, O God-loving emperor. I have directed to your majesty someone similar to the incorporeal beings and a shepherd of all of us, and give a reception proper to your majesty to Father George, by whose prayer may God fortify your holy reign throughout the ecumeny. Then the emperor, fully understanding his words, greeted Father George with great honor and said, whatever you wish, our majesty will do for you. The emperor was so much intrigued by his worthiness that he began to speak and to question the monk concerning spiritual matters and canonical rules. At that time, some noble and distinguished persons from Rome and Armenia stood before the emperor. Among them was Gagik of Kars and other princes of the imperial court, because it was a peaceful time and a peaceful and appropriate time. The emperor continued to ask, as I have mentioned above, about the Orthodox faith, namely, is there any division between your faith and the perfect undefiled faith of the Greeks? Sorry. The Blessed One explained the true faith of ours, of the Georgians, in such a sublime and divinely brilliant way that he left the emperor and his princes astonished. He told the emperor, this is the true faith of our people. Having accepted it once, we have not strayed either to the left or to the right, and will never stray unless it is the will of God. The emperor was surprised at the words that have never strayed, and told the monk, I thank God, honorable father, for what I have heard from you, since I have never heard it before. I am a man raised as a military person and do not have detailed knowledge of all. Since I hold this secret of imperial power, I wish to know all about the Greeks and the Romans. After all, it is the true faith that in the first place is required from an emperor. Tell me, how is it that you and we offer the bloodless sacrifice with leavened bread and add water to wine, but the Romans offer it with unleavened bread and do not add water? It seems to me this strange and contradictory. What is the meaning of the leaven or salt that is added to the dough, or what the water that is added to the wine? Explain to us. Let us understand, Holy Father. The Blessed One said, O Emperor, since the beginning there have been many heresies among the Greeks, and they have erred many times. So the God-serving emperors, such as yourself, called the holy councils in order to examine in detail the providence of Christ our God and his coming in the flesh. And investigations were carried out with regard to the Lord's flesh. And it was established by the council that we should consider dough as the flesh of Christ and the leaven as the rational soul, which is the same as in Greek would be nous, and salt as the mind in opposition to the heresy of the faithless Apollinarius, who spoke about the flesh of Christ, the Lord, as being without soul and mind, Apollinarius himself being deprived of soul and mind. But mixing water with wine is for the blood and water that came out of the side of the Savior, as John Chrysostom says. This is the explanation and reason of these matters. As for the Romans, since they have once confessed God, they have not strayed, nor has any heresy been introduced among them. Just as the head of the apostles, Peter offered the bloodless sacrifice, and even more, just as the Lord himself offered to the disciples on the night of the Last Supper, they do it in the same way, and there is nothing divisive in it if it is based on true faith. The Roman princes greatly rejoiced, since they had already been asked to explain this matter, but out of ignorance they could not give an answer to the emperor. They told the Holy One, we shall take you to the Holy Pope, but they never did. So here ends the text. So I thought that this last paragraph especially would be of interest to this group because we come from different backgrounds, different traditions, and this is interesting that this conversation between Father George and Emperor Constantine Doukas is happening in a few years after the schism. It is about 1064, 1065, because it was very few months before his death. So he so that age. And Father George speaks, gives such an interesting interpretation to what were taken as major points at that time. So filioque at this point is not mentioned. So only two points are mentioned here, right? So this is the leavened and unleavened bread, use of leavened or unleavened bread, and mixing water with wine. With this, about this leavened and unleavened bread, there are many opinions. We know that New Testament uses leaven in two ways, as a positive symbol, but also as a negative symbol. And variety of liturgical practices in the early church was not seen an obstacle to the one faith. So one way to interpret Father George's position is that it's not taken into the dogmatic field, but it's rather seen as a way to practice it. Yes, like for example, Jerusalem and Alexandria is believed in the beginning to use for the holy sacrifice unleavened bread. But Orthodox certainly insist on the use of the leavened bread, using various arguments. One of them is that Jesus would not follow the Jewish tradition, while the Latins sometimes, I notice, use the same argument to prove the opposite, that Jesus did not reject the law of Moses. Also, it is believed that artos, mentioned in the Last Supper, the Greek word for bread, artos, is understood as a leavened bread, which is opposed to azimon. But Lampe dictionary does not say that artos is particularly leavened bread, although it says that it is a loaf bread, but when it is describing unleavened bread, then it azimon is added to artos. So, but the first meaning is not said that it's a leavened bread. The biggest authorities on the Orthodox part later defending the use of leavened bread are Mark the Ephesus in the 15th century at the Council of Florence, calling upon Latins to eliminate the dead sacrifice in unleavened bread. Also in the 11th century, Peter, the Patriarch of Antioch, who is of the same era that Father George, wrote a letter to Patriarch Michael Carolarius, where he says that churches of Alexandria and Jerusalem offer the holy sacrifice with the unleavened bread under the influence of Latins. And so he finds it, so it was, the letter is dated with, as far as Borkin mentions it, is 1052, so before the schism. So it was considered as wrongdoing. So Father George resigned from his position as abbot of Iviron in 1056. And then after 10 years, he died. And in between this, during these 10 times, he did many things. One of his activities we just read about, when he went for 4 or 5 years to Georgia and helped Georgians with various things. So it seems that he's not. I wrote about it, but perhaps there more arguments are needed to prove that Father George was not in full agreement with Michael Carolarius in this. So that's why he expresses his position quite freely. Another matter which is mentioned here is mixing wine and water, and he does not speak too much about it. We know that Sixth Council, Ecumenical Council, indeed prohibited the use of wine without water, but this was also a matter of mixed practice. Latins also use water to mix with water, and for instance, the 12th century canonist Theodore Balsamon does not consider this not mixing water with wine a great sin, because actually his comment is that the most orthodox among the Orthodox, like the Iberians in the beginning, were not not mixing water with wine. So it was not a grave mistake. So these are the 2 points that Father George finds an interesting answer. I think it should be interesting to see how we today understand this text. If you look at the interpretation, contemporary interpretation of the text, and in contemporary I mean last 30 years, some writings been made on the text in Georgia, which is in Georgian language, so you have no access to this, but I can tell you most of the comments are trying to find an excuse for Father George for saying so. So some people say that, oh, it must be an interpolation because it's later interpolation. He could not say this. Some people say that he was forced to say so, but this extended version of the reading today I offered you because I wanted to show that Father George was a very respectful theologian, monk, intellectual, so he would not be, his words would be taken seriously, and he would stand 100% behind his words. So the most interesting part of his answer, in my opinion, is that he speaks about the importance of true faith. So he says that does not matter how you offer the holy sacrifice. The most important things on what kind of faith it is based. Okay, so I stop here now, and I wait for your comments or questions.
Well, thank you very much, Tamara. That was fascinating and brought up all sorts of questions. So I hope the audience, listeners, will have lots of questions. But a question that occurred to me, how late do Georgian monks feature on Mount Athos? Was the Georgian presence continuous for several centuries, or is it not known?
Until the mid 14th century, Iviron was still the Georgian property. But from the mid 13th century, the protos made a decision, protos of Mount Athos made a decision that 2 leading positions would be taken by the Greeks, and the rest would be held by the Georgians, because at some point the Greeks outnumbered Georgians. Definitely they were. So it was a large monastery. So at some in the 11th century, the documents, the acts, actually these documents from Iviron confirmed that there were up to 300 monks. So they couldn't be all Georgians, but they tried very much to keep it as long as possible, but then it was not possible after the mid 15th century.
Yes, thank you. No, I hope there'll be questions. So anyone with a question, comment, most welcome. Well, if I could put another point, in a way you could say that George is avoiding the everyday controversies between the churches over matters of ritual and leavened bread, unleavened, and so on, and moving to a higher level. And that is something that one sometimes finds in my experience in Syriac writings, in Jacob of Sirogin, in a controversial time, he sort of moved above the level of the controversy to a different level. And this seems to be what Father George is doing here. But if one wanted to look at it from a more cynical point of view, it might be that he is using as we're pointing out, friendship with the Latins, or commonality with the Latins, and as well as with the Byzantines, in opposition to the Armenians, because a little later in that passage, yes, it says that the Armenian present was not pleased with Father George's answer.
Yes. No, actually, the Armenian episode is so unpleasant that, yeah, I was very, it was very awkward for me to translate it. And I even put a little note apologizing, but I couldn't change the text.
Yes.
Yeah, so it was really, but with Latins, there was absolutely no problem.
Yes. Now, here's a question. How can we differ saints and Bollandists in the middle and medieval culture? Sorry, that's disappeared.
Is it any difference between the cultures in this name?
Is there a difference between they're being called? I'm not quite sure I understand that. I think it's to do with the definition of who is a saint and how saints get called saints. And of course, in the Middle Ages, we had no Bollandists around to, as it were, adjudicate on such matters. And how did people become saints in the Georgian church? Was it through commemoration in the calendar?
Oh, yes, but yeah, the process is the same as in all the Orthodox churches. Yeah, it should be, there should be some signs.
Yes.
And then the synod, the church makes, yeah, in fact, it should be the church, not only synod, but yeah, in the past, it was the church, which meant also lay people.
So I was thinking, as far as I can make out in the Syriac churches, it's only very recently that you have formal, and really, I guess, since, I'm not sure, certainly since 17th century, that there's a formal way of proceeding. And in the past, you can see from calendars and the commemorations in manuscripts that there are changes over time. Certain saints disappear, others appear, and there's always a solid core of well-known saints, but there is at either end there's saints who drop out and saints who come in. But that's much earlier.
Yeah, I'm not aware of the process of dropping out. Perhaps I just don't know. But popular veneration certainly works. Yeah, and then the church sort of takes it up, the popular veneration. And also, I think local churches, I can speak on behalf of the Georgian Church of Georgia. For instance, if you are familiar with Saint Grigol Peradze, yes, you know, the 20th century saint, and who was canonized not long ago, maybe 30, 40 years, 30 years ago. Yeah, I remember, I don't remember quite the year now, but in the 90s, I believe, yeah. And he was promoted by the Church of Georgia and Orthodox Church in Poland, because he lived in Poland and yes, actually he died in Auschwitz. So yes. I don't know if other churches recognize him as a saint, but because he's an Orthodox saint, they cannot deny it. So I'm not quite sure how it works.
Yes, that's a nice case. He was a great scholar too. And
he was a good scholar, yes.
Yes, quite a famous one. Have we more questions?